First of all, thank you so much for watching this presentation for the Indigenous Ecocriticism panel. My name is Melina Pereira Savi, and I'm a Brazilian scholar. I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at the English Language and Literature postgraduate program at the Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina, or Federal University of Catarina, in southern Brazil. As a Brazilian, the last year has been challenging to say the least. We've had to deal not only with a devastating pandemic, but also with Bolsonaro, about whom I believe all of those watching have heard of. The extent to which the Amazon forest has been illegally explored since Bolsonaro came into power should cause horror in us all. The Brazilian people have suffered greatly in this pandemic. And as I write, we have reached the mark of 500,000 COVID-caused deaths. Brazilian indigenous populations, however, have been hit the hardest. Sanitary barriers that were imposed for their protection were infringed by land grabbers. They have suffered continuous attacks from miners. The laws that protect indigenous land demarcations are now under threat, and the toll of COVID-19 caused deaths is 150% higher for indigenous populations when compared to the national average. I want to acknowledge the land on which I now stand in Florianópolis, Santa Catarina, as the land of the Guarani people, the Kaingang people, and the Choclang people. Although I would like to explore these issues at length, for they are urgent, I will move on to the presentation where I discuss ideas that illuminate the reasoning behind such an appalling scenario. The title of my talk is What Does It Mean to Be Human and Non-Human in Thomas King's and Ailton Krenak's fiction and non-fiction works. I have taught King's short story Rendezvous twice in this pandemic. Myself and the students were baffled as to how King's story illuminates our tendency to wish away problems without examining their root causes. Ailton Krenak, whose works my students also read, has some answers as to why that is. I'll start with the story. In Rendezvous, a short story published in the collection of stories by King named A Short History of Indians in Canada, Thomas King imagines an unnamed Canadian town where, to the dismay of its human dwellers, wild animals move to and take over streets, public spaces, private gardens, swimming pools, and attics. Moose, wolverine, mountain lions, buffalo, among other wild animals, having lost their habitat as a consequence of the relentless advances of human progress, in scare quotes, into forests, interrupt the, again in scare quotes, natural flow of the city with their sudden arrival. Aside from the baffling reaction of the city's human dwellers, not much happens apart from the arrival of the animals and their complete vanishing by the end of the story. Rendezvous makes evident the artificial and mostly idealized relationship urban, middle-class Western populations have developed with nature. Out there, where it should be, the wild has its place as a site of contemplation and eventual enjoyment, but the wild is unwelcome in the city. The imaginative exercise King proposes can lead us to wonder that, if it's so outrageous to have animals invading the city, how should wild animals feel with the cutting down of their home for the construction of golf courses, roads, and resorts? The ontological inversion that King plays with is comprehensively addressed by the wonderful Brazilian indigenous thinker and activist Ailton Krenak, who is from the Krenak Nation and who has recently published 2 books, namely Ideas to Postpone the End of the World, published in 2019, and A Vida não é útil, published in 2020, and in a free translation would mean something like life isn't useful. Krenak understands that human exceptionalism, or the Western idea of what it means to be human, which is not to be non-human, is at the heart of the misconception that leads us to understand that our livelihoods are not inextricably connected to the natural and non-human world. In this presentation, I intend to read Krenak's ontological revision of what it means to be human alongside King's story to ponder how these indigenous fiction and non-fiction works can contribute to the discussions about the current emergencies we are facing with the pandemic, the climate, biodiversity, freshwater use, the acidification of the ocean, among other tragedies. I'll start with a few words by Thomas King and then move on to Krenak's articulations and how they illuminate King's short story, Rendezvous. King is a remarkable and prolific Cherokee, Greek, American, Canadian author. His work is marked by humor, and acute racial, ethnic, and social criticism. He often ponders the role of stories in establishing and stabilizing worldviews and ways of going about in the world, and the role of creation stories in explaining the worldviews that certain groups hold on to in justifying their ways of going about in the world. Native narratives, such as The Woman Who Fell from the Sky, for instance, represent much more collaborative world-building practices and beliefs than, say, Adam and Eve and their expulsion from the Garden of Eden. He explores this theme to quite an extent in The Truth About Stories, a Native Narrative, which is a book adapted from CBC Massey lectures he gave in 2003. In fact, the short story Rendezvous has many layers of meaning, and one of them makes a direct reference to the creation of the world. The story has 7 days, the first of which is when the wild animals take over the city, and on the 6th, absolutely all animals disappear. By the 7th day, the only animals left are the humans. I won't focus on the creation story layer of Rendezvous, but it's worth noting its relevance as a storytelling apparatus. Stories are both wondrous and dangerous things, King remarks. With stories, we can establish ideas that pass for the truth and inform the formation of our ethos. He gives the example of a visual story, for instance, that of the photographer Edward Curtis, who went about the United States looking for Indians to photograph. Some of the most remarkable pictures by Curtis were the product of his imagination. In the trunk of his car, he carried all sorts of costumes to dress the Indians according to what he thought they should look like. When one beholds the world not as it is, but as it should be, and always according to reference points and desirable power structures that inform one's values, one is engaging in world building, in storytelling. Ailton Krenak addresses this notion. He speaks of humanity as a willed fantasy. Not what is, but what a group of people think that is. The humanity we think we are, he says, is utterly limited. In Brazilian indigenous cosmology, he explains, one often refers to oneself as having been in previous lives a fish, a tree, a mountain, or having them as one's uncle, grandmother, or brother. That isn't a wild notion. It's plausible. It's a fact, he explains. The notion of what constitutes humanity is radically different from what Western colonizers, as Krenak puts it, forced down the throats of native populations in their first encounters and in the still ongoing frictions between them. To put it succinctly, Krenak argues that the notion of humanity that has been brought by European colonizers and developed in the Americas has failed among native populations for several reasons. Among them are the fact that the Enlightenment project was, for land-based people, extremely limiting. The idea that Europeans were arriving in hold of a certain kind of light or knowledge that would save native populations from their darkness, the gift of civilization, was plain and simply a mistake. The European notion of human had a configuration that not only excluded them, the native populations, but also the animals and nature they are with. Alienated from the right of humanhood, how could they buy into this project? Still, the project was thrust upon them, among which, and I quote from Krenak, the school, the Bible, the cross, the university, the road, the railway, the mining company, the punch. Native populations fiercely resisted when the Enlightenment project was forced upon them and are still resisting. They simply saw and see no logic in buying into a project of progress that sees as instrumental everything on which we depend to thrive as humans. And noting here that his notion of humanity is not the Western one, so in here he includes humans, animals, and nature at large, the entire biosphere. It's also important to highlight that by including all under the umbrella of humanity, Krenak is not claiming that we are all the same. There are differences among humans, of course, but they are not the differences Western cosmologies insist on to justify the oppression of certain groups of humans. And there are differences among humans, non-humans, and the natural world. But he claims that while Western cosmologies focus on what makes us different from one another and other beings, the native cosmologies he inhabits and knows of focus on the similarities. And they are therefore capable of identifying our irrefutable shared humanity. What kind of special humanity is this that we claim for ourselves, he asks. As we distance ourselves from non-humans and the natural world, he claims, we are alienating ourselves of our own humanity. We are closer to our constructions of what aliens would be like, not belonging to this world, than to the worldly creatures which we claim to be. We're more sci-fi than human. As the Western civilization project eats up the world, Krenak sees himself as an observer who is interested to find how Western populations will tackle the challenges that are building up and outright exploding before our eyes, such as political neoliberalism, climate change, ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, the pandemic, problems of our causing. In his most recent book, A Vida não é útil, Krenak made a bold statement. With the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're seeing that humans are the true plague of the world, as we devastate the environments and breach human rights protocols in the management of the pandemic, all in the name of progress, a fabricated idea that makes us believe that we are going somewhere, though we don't really know where there is. In Rendezvous, the town citizens are taken aback at the audacity of the animals to invade their golf courses and get in the way of their shopping mall experience. We first learn of the invasion with Evelyn and Alistair Dougal. Evelyn is telling her husband about when she was having tea under a tree in their garden, itself a contemplative activity in nature, and the skunks parade past her, she puts it, as if they owned the place. The idea of ownership stands out in this context. In fact, throughout the story, humans never wonder whether where they stand has ever been the site of species that are no longer there. However, in the story, the skunks, and later we learn exotic birds, ducks, wolverines, and many other species, take matters into their own hands and repossess what was once also theirs. The immediate plan for Evelyn and Alistair, of course, is to get rid of the skunks that have come to live in their attic. At first, only during commercials of the program that Alistair is watching, as the religious experience of TV watching shall not be interrupted, and later, as they find out that the situation is endemic and the entire community have their houses and streets, public parks, golf courses filled with animals, getting rid of the animals becomes the core intention of the entire community. The public parks, golf courses, resorts, and the lake house that the Dougal couple goes to at the end of the story are worth exploring here. Nature in these sites has a use. It's supposed to work as a buffer between urban life with its amenities and stressors at one end and the contemplative life at the other end. There is no space for complexity or surprise in this utilitarian setup. The city is meant to be safe for humans. It's quite comical when the town mayor suggests that people should take their night walks in their cars because it's unsafe for humans, or at least for small groups of humans, because of the nocturnal predators that are now all over the place. The forests, however, grow unsafe for wildlife. We wish to sanitize the cities of unwanted animals and unwanted humans, to rid the cities of what Krenak calls the subhumanity that neoliberalism generates. The city mayor organizes a town hall meeting and the residents start comparing their woos. Wolverines in one's gazebo, moose on another's backyard, and mountain lions in the mall's parking lot. An Indian named Mr. Wagamise is introduced as working at the Department of Natural Resources, And Derwin, Alistair's neighbor, relieved at the sight of Mr. Wagamese, explains, "About time, this nature thing is getting out of hand." Nature is thus walled off. There are limits to which it can expand over what has been established as acceptable in an urban environment. There is no curiosity as to the effects of one's actions, the effects of progress, or the perspective that bordering out the wild in favor of one's personal safety comes at a cost for the wildlife that is losing space to each human enterprise, as each human enterprise advances into the forests. The use of nature is for the benefit of humans and humans alone. The figure of the Indian, Mr. Wagamese, is of course emblematic. Alistair remarks the following to his wife: "An Indian, now we're getting somewhere." The expectation is that Mr. Wagamese will render possible a plan to effect a clean, sanitary cut as to where those wild animals belong and get them back there, as a sorcerer that can be summoned to deal with what is unwanted in what concerns nature. The effect is twofold. First, the white Western man understands that he not only is not part of nature, but also wants no business with it, nor wants it messing with its notion of what nature should behave like for him. Second, the Indian is conflated with nature, and not in a good way from Alistair's point of view. The conflation of certain groups of people with nature has been used for the reiteration of the ideas that, drawing from Orwell, all humans are human, but some are more human than others. The news Mr. Wagamese brings is far from bright. Understanding that the mere presence of the wild animals in the city and the news about the dying forests and oceans haven't managed to produce a response in the population, Mr. Wagamese resorts to a language Westerners seem to understand, that of graphs and charts. He explains to a baffled audience that humans have always lived with animals and that the situation that they are complaining about will only get worse. He shows a new slide where there is a picture of the boreal forest, which has a number of lines and cuts running through it. 20 years ago, it was a pristine wilderness, Mr. Wagamese says, and the audience is in disbelief that the forest has been virtually eradicated with roads, resorts, golf courses, and the like. The cognitive disconnect of the audience is such that they can't understand how these things could take up that much space. They can't, and that is the cognitive disconnect. To understand oneself as having played no part in the depletion of the environment. The Anthropocene, the epoch of humans, is symbolic of this cognitive disconnect. Humanity is too broad an idea to be able to encompass all humans in terms of environmental impact. Humans as a geological force, as Dipesh Chakrabarty puts forward, is an idea that we are not willing to acknowledge. He puts it this way: to call human beings geological agents is to scale up our imagination of the human. There was no point in human history when humans were not biological agents, but we can become geological agents only historically and collectively. That is, when we have reached numbers and invented technologies that are on a scale enough to have an impact on the planet itself. To call ourselves geological agents is to attribute to us a force on the same scale as that released at other times when there has been a mass extinction of species." End of quote. Chakrabarty, however, is also suspicious of the idea of humankind as a geological agent when he contends that mankind is too inclusive a notion, while the reality of the world is that the poorest nations don't carry the weight of carbon footprint in the same measure as the richest ones, or even as the richest classes in the poorest nations. He poses the idea that the actions of humans that lead to global warming, such as the burning of fossil fuel, industrialization of animal stock, the clearing of tropical forests, are not isolated events, but are deeply rooted in what has become of Western capitalism and its imperial or quasi-imperial domination by the West of the rest of the world. In Ideas to Postpone the End of the World, Ailton Krenak highlights that the quality of the nomenclature Anthropocene itself reflects the anthropocentrism it seeks to criticize. It conveys our attachment to an idea of an Earth that has no place in our imaginaries without us, or even with us, but engaged in a different way of living. A world without us, in this understanding, is not even a world at all, so it looks like the end of the world. He claims that when the planet can no longer provide for the lifestyle some of the most privileged humans on Earth have gotten used to, they shout into the four directions that the world is coming to an end. What most do not want, he claims, is to interrupt the state of ecstatic pleasure that has been ensured to some on the false premise that culture is separate from nature, which is the setting stone of human exceptionalism. Krenak, however, isn't dismissive of the term. On the contrary, he contends that the understanding that we are living in an age called Anthropocene should make us tremble. We have let the Enlightenment project, with its idea of humanity that excludes the human from nature and forges discriminatory notions even of what constitutes a human, go too far. We have excluded from life, he claims, and I quote, the ways of organization that are not integrated with the world of commodity, putting all other ways of living at risk, at least those we have been encouraged to believe as possible, where one could find the idea of co-responsibility with the places where we live and the respect for other beings' right to live, and not simply this abstraction that we have allowed to constitute as one humanity, which excludes all other forms of humanity and all other beings. End of quote. For Krenak, any understanding of the human as disconnected from the surrounding environment and disentangled from non-human life is problematic. The word he uses, co-responsibility, conveys a sentiment that most often arises when one is implicated in the outcome of one's actions. The understanding functions on a basis of a nature-culture mentality leads one to allow for places, non-humans, and things to become merely the site of industrial and extractive activity, devoid of a connection with humans, if not for the entrancing state of pleasure that they can offer. Going back to Rendezvous on this note, by the end of the story on the 6th day, Evelyn and Alistair Dougal go to the cabin by the lake. And by the 6th day, as I mentioned before, all animals have disappeared. There are no sounds of chirping birds, nor the annoying bites of mosquitoes. The loon serenade to which the couple had grown accustomed on their visits to the cabin doesn't happen. The loons are gone. There is a sense of anticipation in the story's last paragraph. Evelyn and Alistair sit back on the deck by the lake and prepare for the loon serenade, which is about to begin, but it never does. It's dead quiet. The anticipation, the silence, and the sad note on which the story ends is telling of a crucial point. We are human only insofar as we are in relation with other non-humans, and non-humans are human both in the sense that humanity is a construed identification with an idea, and in the sense that there is no logic to any notion of the human in isolation, as a standalone animal. The notion of the human in King's story is the story we have been telling ourselves about what it means to be human. Krenak argues that this notion of human we now adhere to is insufficient. What Krenak and King are trying to show us is that we can rewrite the story and come up with a much less limited notion of what it means to be human, non-human, or maybe neither. We could come up with something else entirely, something that celebrates, as Krenak suggests, what humans and non-humans have in common rather than on what makes us different. As I mentioned in the beginning, when I gave students these texts, King's story and Krenak's questionings of the construction of the notion of humanity we have come to embrace in the last 500 years, two things called their attention. In King's story, what is of nature that we find a nuisance, we try to get rid of. The Dougal couple never tries to question their notion of humanity, in which progress is a given and can't be changed. Evelyn tries to grope for answers as to why the wild animals take to the city, but is always pulled back by her husband, Alistair, who never steps out of his own idealized humanity to ponder whether the advances into the wild are harmful or not, for those who live there, and also for himself. As the Dugo couple, most people have been wanting to rid themselves of the pandemic without pondering its root cause. Krenak, on the other hand, outright argues that the notion of humanity which is prevalent is the reason why we are in this mess in the first place. However, in a worldview in which one understands that the river is one's grandfather, as the Krenaki people do, the mountains are a family, where the animals communicate with humans through dreams and actions, there is no space for the extent of the exploration which we have thus far effected. In this understanding, nature, the wild, the non-humans are not to be used. Life isn't to be transformed into utility. It doesn't serve a utilitarian purpose. Its joy, fruition, its entanglement with all that surrounds it, that surround us. We're not only robbing what we instrumentalize of this sense of joy. We ignore the kinship, the joy, the wonders of these entanglements at our own peril. Thank you very much.